Hello everyone, I think it's recording. Although I can't actually guarantee that, so this could be a massive waste of time. So yes, sorry, I'll introduce myself first. So my name is Shona and I've been asked to talk to you during your Society Matters week. And I was given free rein to talk about any of the topics and subjects that I teach. And that kind of ranges from anything to everything, but typically it's criminology, sociology and research issues. So for this week what I've done is I've chosen to speak about criminology, and that's largely because I've got a fascination with crime and I tend to take any opportunity I can to talk about it. This is being recorded on Zoom. I'm hoping there's not going to be any technical issues. We'll see about that. And just as a pre-warning, you might get a slight interruption from a puppy. She's 6, but she tends to like some attention. Anyway, so crime. Excuse me. So crime. It's when I spoke about a morbid fascination, I don't think I'm the only one who has that. Crime, I think and feel, is something that's a constant source of anxiety, and yet at the very same time, it is also a source of fascination. And that occurs across many spectrums. It's not just an individual issue or a local, it can be national and international. And there's certainly, well, to me, it's seemingly endless political and media and popular debates about the moral decline of our societies, and there's a sense that youth are out of control, the growing anarchy, and that the government's job is to stem the tide of this criminal, if you like, criminal or crime wave. And actually the concerns of those tend to focus on what we would refer to as exceptional crime. Now, I don't mean exceptional as in brilliant, I just mean exceptional as in they're not necessarily the norm. So things like international terrorism, serial killers, crimes of passion, stabbing, shootings, child abduction, they along with this sort of more mundane stealing and pickpocketing and whatnot, certainly seem to intensify our fear about crime and antisocial behaviour. But what constitutes crime is something that is dependent on the time and place in which you live. I think I might have actually needed to, yes, that's fine. So to start off this particular discussion, even though you can't speak to me, but to start it off, I think I'd like you to think about what crime means to you, and what do you perceive to qualify as a crime. And I think you'll, if I just nip onto the next slide, you'll see that even governments tend to have this capacity to focus on crime as an individual problem and not necessarily look at what we would refer to in criminology as the bigger picture. So here's a quote from the Labour government's Respect paper. Now, I know that's 2007, and that still seems pretty recent to me. I sometimes forget we're in 2021. But the reason I've picked it is because of its focus. It's nothing to do with the date. So crime is doing something forbidden by law. That could be means stealing a mobile phone, vandalism, graffiti, mugging, stealing or taking or selling drugs. Now, the problem with that kind of definition, and arguably that's not really changed. So whether that was said in 2007 or now, actually there's very little difference. But they tend to focus on particular populations. So you have that outlook of, okay, these are street crimes. They are likely to be committed by disillusioned, disenfranchised, we've got lots of different words for it now. But typically a common phrase is problem populations or youth. And it seems to be within urban and public contexts. Now, the thing is that is a small part of the crime problem, but it's also a very small part about what we study in criminology. Now, let's expand that a little bit by talking about what's referred to as faceless crimes. There are crimes that have historically been either ignored, or I say crimes, they weren't crimes actually at the time, but they've been ignored because they occurred in the private sphere. And what we mean by that is the home. There's also a larger issue regarding the role of actions that take place by corporations and by even by states, and I mean nation states. So we have a concern about actions that take place in spheres that are both private and public, but also in criminology, it goes beyond the individual and looks at the national and international as well. And so it's a really broad topic. Now, the faceless crimes can be anything that includes things like human trafficking, drugs trafficking, weapons trafficking, although eventually there is a face attached to them, but they're not the ones that you immediately think of. Our media does a really good job of focusing on the sort of interpersonal violent crimes. So we don't necessarily think about victims beyond that. But if you think about environmental harm and the increase in health issues such as asthma, we are far more likely to be a victim of environmental harm than we are a victim of crime, and yet crime remains our focus. So there is a big question in criminology about why that is the case. Now, I mentioned it earlier, it's because it's part of a political tool. There are really unlikely to be any political parties that get voted in if they don't have some kind of direction regarding controlling crime and punishment within their manifestos. So you've still got to consider the way that that narrative is being directed within criminology. But let's think about the definition of crime in the first place before we go down that route. I got a wee bit distracted there. That's what my students get that a lot. So Paul Tappan's definition of crime is often referred to in 1947. Now even I wasn't born then, so this would be described as an older source, I think. So the emphasis here is an action can only be seen as a crime if it has broken a codified law. And that's where the debate comes in, because those codified laws change depending on the society that you live in and the time in which you live. But you also, as a perpetrator, have to have the intent and you have to have acted voluntarily. If those conditions are met and you've broken a codified law, then there should also be some kind of punishment attached to it. Now, that seems pretty straightforward on the surface of it, but it's actually really problematic and contested within criminology itself. So let's have a look at some of these behaviours here in this list. So we've got abortion, taking the life of another person, slavery, global warming, antisocial behaviour, keeping money found on the street. And so the question I've posed here is, which of those do you consider to be criminal? Now, we're not going to go through every single one of them, but I've put the list there so that when this is finished, you can maybe go back and have a review of it. Let's think about, in the first instance, the taking of the life of another. Now, that seems pretty straightforward in many ways. So it would be wrong for you to murder somebody, but actually how we define and perceive that action is dependent on the context in which it takes place. So let's imagine for a second you joined the army, and being part of the army, it's kind of expected, when I say kind of expected, it is expected that if called upon, you will take somebody else's life. Now that's part of the role of the army, and it's sanctioned by the state, so it's obviously expected and accepted. In contrast, if you do that to someone that you know, or you're walking down the street and, you know, for whatever reason, your anger takes over and that's what's happened, you will feel a very different consequence of that behaviour. So the action isn't necessarily what is the problem, it's the context in which it takes place. Now, that can be said, I think, largely for many of the examples there, but the one that we're going to look in a little bit more detail here is abortion. Now, when we talk about crime as being something that is contested, what we really mean by that is that notions of criminal conduct are dependent on time and place. So abortion used to be illegal, it's now legal in the UK. The parameters which surround abortion that make it legal in the UK are different to another country. So we've got you know, the sort of no universal sense necessarily of moral thinking, moral reasoning, and what necessarily makes right and wrong decisions. So I've put in here this example. Now, I think you may be given these slides. I'm hoping you'll be given these slides, because that link there will take you to a New York Times article that discusses the very recent changes in some of the states in in America, where they are pushing as far as possible to make abortion illegal again. Now, the assumption by doing that is that if you make the behaviour illegal, then you'll stop the behaviour. Now, anyone who's looked at the history of abortion and women's rights knows that that's not necessarily going to happen. What you're likely to do is push the problem out of the state. Now, I say the word problem, I mean the problem devising laws in which people have rights. So whose right takes priority here, the right of the fetus or the right of the mother? So these debates are ongoing and they're far from settled, and they're unlikely to be solved within this morning's session. But it certainly again raises that question about what we assume to be right and wrong is actually very culturally specific. Now, of course, that's as I said, that's one example. We can also look at bigger problems. You know, what about crimes that are conducted by the state? Well, one of the problems we face is that if a behaviour is conducted by the state, the chances are it won't be defined as a crime. They're hardly going to commit something that's going to hold themselves to account for any behaviour. But throughout history, we've seen issues regarding the rights of a population, along with the actions of the state. Now, this again is another article that I'm hoping you'll get access to, but there have been allegations that in America, women who are trying to cross the border from Mexico into the US are being forcefully sterilised. Now, that's the kind of action that you would be, well, I would imagine you would be more familiar with in terms of historical stories of and events like eugenics prior to World War II, which took place in the US, UK, and most of Europe, and it was only after World War II that programme was, well, I say abandoned. I mean, these are recent allegations. So that raises this question about the power of the state to be able to act with impunity and still somehow receive the support of you know, a voting crowd, not necessarily those who are being forced into being sterilised, but certainly it's popular as an agenda amongst others. So what we're really saying there is that crime is something that is contested. It is something that is dependent on time and place. And it's also something that's constantly changing. It has to, you know, your laws are not the same. They must change with the times. They must reflect the values of a society at that given point. If I can recall, you know, there was a medieval law, don't quote me on the centuries here, but you know, medieval law, where if two people were found or accused of the same crime, then the uglier of the two was the one that was probably more guilty. Now, while I'm a bit cynical about the criminal justice system, I'm not entirely sure that we've really digressed from that ideology. The point being is that we can't, there's no such thing as a universal criminal act or behaviour. It is about the context in which that action takes place.